Frida Lyngstad has always been the quiet one, the poised voice in the shadows of ABBA's spotlight. While the tabloids chased Agnetha and Benny, Frida stayed silent. She never told her side. Not about the tension, not about the betrayal, and certainly not about what really broke the group. But now, after 4 decades, Frida is finally speaking. And what she just admitted about Benny's affair isn't just heartbreaking. It's the kind of truth only time could force out. And it changes everything fans thought they knew about ABBA's final days. Frida Lyngstad, known to the world as Frida, was always the quiet storm inside ABBA. She didn't seek the spotlight like Agnetha, nor did she control the music like Benny or Bjorn. But when Frida sang, there was something else behind her voice, something deeper. It wasn't just technique. It was pain, memory, restraint. And for fans who truly listened, there was always a sense that Frida was holding something back. Offstage, she rarely talked about the drama. While Benny and Agnetha's relationship was picked apart by the tabloids, and Bjorn gave clever interviews about the band's creative process, Frida was measured, poised, and deeply private. She wasn't the type to air her wounds in public, especially not the one wound that never quite healed. Because Frida wasn't just Benny Andersson's bandmate. She was his wife, his second chance, his fresh start after his own past heartbreaks. And for a brief moment in ABBA's whirlwind timeline, it really seemed like they had something that would last. They were the more mature couple, the more grounded pair. People assumed that if anyone could withstand the crushing fame, it would be Benny and Frida. But even then, things weren't quite right. There were long stretches of silence between them, even while they were still touring. There were tense dinners after rehearsals, sudden cold shoulders, and perhaps most tellingly, Frida's reluctance to talk about her marriage in public interviews. Looking back now, the signs were there, but at the time, Frida stayed silent. And when the breakup came, she let the media spin it how they wanted. A mutual split. No hard feelings. Creative differences. Not once did she correct them. Not once did she say what she had really seen. But she saw everything. She saw the long glances Benny gave someone else during a recording session. She noticed how often he stayed behind in the studio, how his stories about late nights stopped making sense. And then, there was the day she walked into a dressing room too early, and saw something that broke her. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that their marriage, their trust, their foundation, had already ended before she'd even been told. She wanted to scream. She wanted to confront him. But more than anything, she wanted to protect the one thing left that still meant something. ABBA. So, she swallowed it. The heartbreak, the humiliation, the questions from fans who didn't know the truth. She put on her costume, fixed her smile, and went on stage night after night, singing harmonies with the very man who had betrayed her, harmonizing with someone she could no longer even look in the eye off stage. And yet, she never let it show. Not in the interviews, not in the albums, not in the reunion attempts. But now, after 4 decades, something changed. Maybe it's age. Maybe it's the distance that only time can give. Or maybe Frida simply realized she no longer needed to protect Benny. Not after everything. Because this isn't just a story about an affair. It's about the cost of silence. And how a woman who had every reason to speak out chose to stay quiet. Until now. In the years following ABBA's meteoric rise, Benny Andersson was seen as the musical genius behind the curtain, crafting melodies, building harmonies, perfecting the sound that would define an era. But while fans celebrated his brilliance, very few saw what was happening behind the scenes, or who was quietly paying the price for it. At the height of ABBA's success, Benny wasn't just overwhelmed, he was everywhere. Producing, composing, attending meetings with labels, jetting off to negotiate contracts, fielding press from every continent. But as his presence grew in the industry, his presence at home dwindled. And for Frida, that absence wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. She wasn't naive. She knew what fame could do to people, but she didn't expect it from him. What made it worse was that Benny was good at hiding things. He wasn't reckless. He didn't leave lipstick on collars or get caught by paparazzi. He simply disappeared in plain sight. Late-night recording sessions. Business dinners that ended far later than they should have. Quiet little studio visits with collaborators no one had ever heard of. He'd come home with excuses that were just believable enough, and Frida, already exhausted by the press, the shows, the internal ABBA tension, chose not to question them. At least not out loud. But inside, the questions festered. Who was he really spending time with? Why had he stopped confiding in her? Why did it feel like she was always walking on eggshells just to keep the peace? It wasn't until much later that the pieces began to come together. Years after the band had unofficially stepped away from the spotlight, a woman, one of Benny's collaborators, spoke in an interview about the emotional connection she'd shared with him during the late 70s. The phrasing was vague. No names were named, but those who had followed the band closely knew exactly who she meant. And Frida? Frida didn't say a word, because she already knew. She'd known back then, even before that fateful day in the dressing room. She just didn't want it to be true. But what made it hurt even more wasn't just the affair itself. It was the fact that Benny never admitted it. Not to her, not to the group, not even to himself. He moved on, remarried, reinvented himself as a composer. He did interviews filled with nostalgia and warmth, always remembering the music, never acknowledging the damage. And for 40 years, Frida carried the weight of that silence. She carried it through award shows, reunion rumors, and even ABBA's recent resurgence. Smiling through it all, never flinching, never speaking the truth. Until recently, in a quiet, unexpected moment during a Swedish interview, meant to celebrate ABBA's legacy, Frida broke from the script. The interviewer had asked about regrets, and Frida, without bitterness, without theatrics, simply said, "I regret protecting someone who wasn't protecting me." She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. And in that one sentence, the unspoken story of Benny's affair, the story Frida had buried for 40 years, finally had a voice. Not for revenge, but for closure. Because sometimes, the most powerful truth is the one whispered after everyone else has already moved on. There are moments in a person's life that split everything in two, before and after. For Frida, that moment came quietly. No confrontation, no shouting, just one glance, and the world she'd built with Benny shattered. It happened backstage during one of ABBA's final tours. The atmosphere had already been tense. There was a heaviness hanging in the air, one that the crew noticed, even if no one dared say it aloud. Frida had started arriving early, not for sound checks or rehearsals, but to find moments of stillness before the chaos of performance. That day, she opened the wrong door. She wasn't supposed to be there, but there they were. Benny and a woman Frida barely recognized. A studio assistant, maybe, someone who wasn't supposed to matter. And yet, in that moment, it was clear she did. They weren't kissing. They weren't even touching. But the way he looked at her, it was the way he used to look at Frida. And that was worse than anything else. Frida didn't say a word. She closed the door, walked away, and went straight to wardrobe like nothing had happened. That night, she performed with a fire in her voice the others hadn't heard in months. She hit every note, smiled through every choreographed move. But the pain didn't stay backstage. For the rest of the tour, Frida wore a mask. And behind that mask was a woman breaking apart, alone in a band of 4. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that ABBA was bigger than this, that professionalism came first. But every time she looked across the stage at Benny, all she could see was what she'd lost. His loyalty, his honesty, and perhaps worst of all, the illusion that their bond had been real. Back then, there was no Instagram, no viral exposés. If something hurt, you buried it deep. Frida buried it in songs like The Winner Takes It All. Even though it was Agnetha's voice carrying the heartbreak, she buried it in silence, in professionalism, in choosing not to make it worse. Because there was one thing Frida feared more than the betrayal, the collapse of ABBA itself. The world saw the group's breakup as inevitable. But Frida knew better. It wasn't the music. It wasn't exhaustion. It was that the people inside the music were no longer protecting each other. She tried to forgive, tried to forget, But the damage had already been done. And when the group disbanded, unofficially, without ceremony, Frida disappeared. She didn't chase solo fame. She didn't feed the tabloids. She went quiet. And in that silence, she rebuilt herself. She found love again, found peace. But she never forgot. Now, at 78, when asked what finally made her speak out, she gave a simple answer. I thought the truth should be part of the story too. Because for 40 years, fans believed ABBA simply drifted apart. But behind that fairy tale ending was a very real woman, left to carry the burden of someone else's choices. And now that burden is no longer hers to carry alone. Frida wasn't the only one who noticed something had shifted. Inside the ABBA camp, silence wasn't just a personal decision, it was a group agreement. Unspoken, but understood. Agnetha could feel it too. Even though her own relationship with Bjorn had already ended, the band still had to function like a family on stage. The chemistry, the harmonies, the public image, it all had to look seamless. But offstage, there were fractures no one could ignore. Frida and Agnetha had never been especially close. Not enemies, but not friends either. They were two very different women thrown into an extraordinary situation and asked to pretend that nothing in their private lives ever spilled onto the stage. So when Frida showed up to rehearsals with red eyes or sat quietly during flights while the rest of the band chatted, Agnetha noticed. And more than once she considered asking, but she didn't, because she already knew the answer. Bjorn, on the other hand, stayed focused on the music. He was the technician, the problem solver. He could sense the tension growing between Frida and Benny, but as long as they were showing up to perform, he didn't push. He kept things moving. That was his role. And Benny, he played his perfectly too. He laughed when the cameras were rolling. He stayed friendly with Frida in interviews. He gave warm smiles and shook hands, never missing a beat. If there was guilt inside him, he buried it well. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part for Frida. Not just the betrayal itself, but the fact that no one stepped in. No one pulled Benny aside and asked, "What are you doing?" No one told him to stop. Everyone acted like it wasn't happening, because acknowledging it would have meant the group was at risk. And in the 1970s, when ABBA was on top of the world, nothing was allowed to risk the brand. So Frida kept quiet, and the rest of the band kept pretending. Even their management played along. Wardrobe fittings were scheduled so Frida and Benny didn't have to arrive at the same time. Hotel room assignments kept them on separate floors. Photographers were told which angles to shoot from to keep body language from becoming too obvious. Behind the glitter and perfection, it was all a delicate illusion. And Frida? She played her part better than anyone. Because while the others were avoiding discomfort, she was carrying pain. For years, fans wondered why she disappeared so quickly after ABBA broke up. Why she didn't immediately pursue a massive solo career. Why she gave so few interviews. Some assumed she was simply tired. Others believed she'd said all she needed to through the music. But the truth was far more personal. Frida wasn't just stepping away from a band. She was stepping away from a betrayal no one dared name. Not even her. Until now. And when she finally broke her silence, she didn't point fingers. She didn't name names or recount every detail. That's not her style. Instead, she gave the world one sentence. I stayed because the music mattered. But part of me disappeared the day he stopped being mine. It wasn't just about Benny. It was about how easily people can become invisible when their pain is inconvenient. And now, at last, Frida isn't invisible anymore. To the millions who adored ABBA, the group represented joy, glitter, escapism. They were the soundtrack to weddings, breakups, new beginnings. People didn't just love the music, they trusted it. But over the years, something unspoken crept into the sound. Even as the group kept producing hits, fans began to notice a shift. The songs started sounding heavier, the performances more distant, and no one could quite explain why. Now we know. Because once Frida opened the door, even just slightly, everything fans had sensed began to make sense. Suddenly, the tension in knowing you wasn't just artistic, it was personal. The ache in one of us stopped being a pop melody and started feeling like a cry for help. And the winner takes it all. so often attributed to Agnetha's heartbreak, now felt like a mirror, reflecting what Frida had endured in silence. Fans didn't know the truth, but they felt the truth. And Frida? She felt it with every lyric she was asked to sing beside the man who betrayed her. The pain never broke the group on stage, but it did leave scars. Scars that only time could dull. Scars Frida carried into the decades that followed. For years, she was asked about reunions. Could ABBA get back together? Would they ever tour again? Was the chemistry still there? Frida always answered with grace. She praised the legacy, honored the music, but she never talked about the cost, about what it took to smile beside someone who had broken her heart, not just as a partner, but as a human being. And yet, when the ABBA Voyage project was announced decades later, complete with digital avatars and a nostalgic revival, Frida participated. Not because she had forgotten, but because she had finally forgiven. That, perhaps, is the most powerful part of her confession. She didn't reveal Benny's affair to shame him. She revealed it to free herself. Because the truth, no matter how delayed, is still the truth. And by speaking it aloud, Frida reclaimed a part of herself that had been silenced. She reminded the world that ABBA's history isn't just about sequins and stardom. It's also about four very real people, two of whom gave everything to men who couldn't give the same back. And while Agnetha's story has often been the one told, Frida's has lingered in the shadows. Not anymore. Today, fans are beginning to see her differently, not just as the other singer, not just the second half of a duo, but as a woman who endured heartbreak in silence, stayed loyal to a legacy, and waited 40 years to speak her truth. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need revenge. She just needed time. And now, at 78, Frida Lyngstad has finally taken back her story, on her terms. Frida Lyngstad was never the loudest voice in ABBA. She wasn't the tabloid favorite or the flashiest performer. But now, after 40 years, she's become something even more powerful, the quiet voice of truth. What she finally admitted about Benny's affair didn't come with bitterness. There were no dramatic accusations, no details meant to destroy, just honesty, wounded, weary honesty, and somehow that made it hit even harder. Because for fans who had always felt something lingering beneath her performances, some sadness she never quite explained, this was the missing piece. She wasn't just singing someone else's lyrics. She was surviving them. In the decades since ABBA stepped away from the spotlight, each member has carved their own path. Benny became a composer, Bjorn a businessman, Agnetha retreated from the public eye, and Frida? Frida became a woman who rebuilt herself from heartbreak, a woman who chose silence for the sake of peace, and now a woman finally free of the story she never told. For those who still play the records, who still hum Fernando or Chiquitita with a lump in their throat, there's a deeper meaning now, a truth that lingers between the harmonies. A woman who endured what most will never fully understand, and chose decades later to let go, not to hurt anyone, but to finally heal. If this story stayed with you, the next one will stay with you even longer. Watch it now.